Be really great. And thanks to everyone who's joining us from an attendee perspective and anyone who's watching this in the future. Welcome to our Ask Me Anything panel on product and operations as part of 101 Voices on Professional Growth. We've got some awesome people joining us today. We've got James, Cassie, Design, and Toby joining us to have a great discussion. Looking forward to it hugely. Do you guys just want to give a super quick intro on yourselves, and then we'll get into some questions and some discussion. Cassie, do you want to go first?
Yeah, sure. Hey guys, I'm Cassie. As any of you who would have heard when joined a few minutes ago, I'm kind of the token American, but Toby will tell you where she's from. I am quite specialized in startup and scale-ups from the ops perspective, so especially those scale-ups in hyper growth. And I've been in Sydney about almost 8 years now, so very into the Aussie startup scene as well.
Toby,
I'll go. I was gonna say I'll go after Cassie since she did a little name drop in there. I'm the token Canadian in the room via the US. So and so I guess I'm Toby. I have been here now 7 years, and so I have been primarily 3 roles have been with startups and then 1 corporate with MYOB. And I really specialize in scaling product teams up, both from product knowledge in building product owners and product managers, but also a lot in processes and bringing in Agile, be it Scrum or Kanban, into the businesses. And currently I'm the head of product with Compono, an amazing new scale up in Sydney and Brisbane.
Hey everybody.
James, I think.
Oh, sorry. Hey everybody, my name is James Kwong. I'm Aussie, born and bred. So I'm the head of product at a company called Unleash Live. So we do AI analytics. My focus is really on bridging design and technology. So I have a strong technology focus, having done a lot of work with analytics, IoT, and artificial intelligence. And I try to bring design and technology through the product as part of our startup. So looking excited for the session.
Awesome, and thanks so much for joining. I'm the CEO and co-founder of Level.io, and we're the sponsors and organizers of the 101 Voices event. In all fairness, I know Kwong and Cassie from previous times at BCG Digital Ventures and previously at ANZ. I guess I describe myself as a product person, but I've worked in pretty much every vertical and every industry in a variety of roles, and we'll come to what makes great product people, but I think a great diversity of experience is a core part of it. But let's jump into some questions. We've got some awesome questions that were submitted before the session beforehand, and I'd love to start with that theme, Toby, that you brought up, which is, wow, 2020, remote work, where we're at. Like a lot of people I've spoken to who lead teams or founded companies are not planning to bring their teams back full time into the office. That's a huge change. Most of them are looking at half blend. That obviously has a huge number of impacts. But you know, maybe first question to you all is what you think that means, what the big macro changes you think 2020 and COVID and remote working has made that are going to last. What do you guys reckon? Cassie, do you want to kick off?
Yeah, sure. So even in my immediate workplace, we've noticed the same. Actually, we're doing a whole internal project about how the future of work looks for us as an org. And we are thinking very much what you mentioned, which is really quite a hybrid of remote working and in-person as well. And I actually think one of the most important factors of how it should move going forward is the empowerment for the individual to decide, while still having kind of the entire group's agreement on the principles that we all want to work within. So, you know, you need to be able to work at the same time sometimes so that you can have meetings with people. You all, you know, maybe agree that certain things are best done in person and how to set those up for success by either scheduling them in advance, making them in a location that works for everyone, and so on. But I actually think, the hybrid model is going to work, and it's about empowering people to decide for themselves within the parameters that the organization has pre-agreed on. One thing that I think is important to call out is that I think because we should empower people to decide what works best for them in the moment, in the day, it means that if one person is remote, everything is remote. So you can't forget that even if most of the people are in the office that particular day, even if a single person is remote, then the tools and technology and the style of that collaboration need to enable the participation from that person who happens not to be there that day. So I think actually that's a big difference. What's happening right now for a lot of people in COVID is that everyone's remote. And I think a really important thing to remember is that moving forward when that's not the case, some people are in person and some people are remote. It is totally different than when everyone is remote.
Yep.
We have to be really mindful to make sure that that collaboration can happen well when there's a difference between people who are in person, and we don't want to kind of exclude the people who are remote.
I'm going to piggyback on that, if you don't mind, Cassie. One of the things with Compono that COVID with us, we were already half in and half out. So most people were already working 2 to 3 days from home. So we had embraced that remote working early on, I mean, way pre-COVID. And so we were set up from a technology perspective and a meeting perspective. So when COVID hit and suddenly everything was remote, within 24 hours, it was a very easy transition for us. And so we've had an incredible run in 2020 compared to a lot of businesses. I think we've hired at latest count, I think 20 people during COVID, and we're about to open another 10 positions. So a little shout out if anyone's looking to join a really cool startup. And so I onboarded remotely. And so that has been a really different experience. I've only met my boss twice. And I've only met colleagues a couple of times when I've hit into the Sydney office. And I have 4 new team members that are also onboarding remotely. I was really concerned with it at first because I am very much a people person, and I really loved the social aspect in an office of, just running to grab a coffee or, overhearing somebody's weekend kind of thing. And then doing that remotely, I think you have to make more of an effort. That's one thing that I think people have done. We've done a really phenomenal job of, doing coffee breaks. So someone will just post and hop up in a Google chat in a meet. And so we do a lot of social things. And I think that that's probably one of the hardest aspect, and there's the cat, the hardest aspect for a lot of people is losing that social touch. And so really making sure post-COVID, I think that we will still be, and not just we COVID, but we as a society will still be half in, half out from that remote. But we really need to make sure that we are staying in touch with our team members and just, the whole, are you okay? I know some people think that's a little cliche, but I think it's really important that we do check in with everybody. The other thing I think that is going to change is that for a lot of businesses, they were very fearful of work from home because they didn't trust people. And then suddenly when COVID has hit, they've had to trust their team members. And a lot of leaders that I've spoken to have seen productivity increase during COVID. And so they're not going to be able to go backwards anymore. And so I just think the whole shape of everything. And then before kicking over to James, just the other thing that I would note, and I loved how you said this, Cassie, that we are always going to have people remote now. And it's also opened up a lot of opportunities for people that are in country, Australia, or country anywhere for that matter, because it doesn't matter where you are anymore. You don't have to be in the city. You don't have to lose 2-3 hours of your day commuting. So I think it's going to open up a lot of diversity for a lot of businesses as well, because you're not kind of in that city center. So those are my thoughts on it.
Great. And we've been quite fortunate because as a startup, we've always had a distributed team. So even pre-COVID, we've had team members working across Australia, North America, and Europe. So we've actually been set up as an organization with the right tools and processes in place to be able to work in a distributed manner. And that doesn't come without its challenges. And I think, Toby, you mentioned trust, and that's a huge one. I think especially for teams that are already based in the same country. I think, Cassie, you hit the nail on the head when you said if one person's remote, then everybody's remote. How do you think about inclusion so that, you might have 8 people in a room and 1 person on video? How do you make them feel welcome? And maybe that means you have to take extra proactive steps in setting up technology, setting up video. And, we've had a meeting the other day where everybody in the meeting room had the video open, even though we could see each other face to face, because so much communication happens through body language, expression, and communication. And I think the trust one is particularly interesting because I think every leader feels a little bit of anxiety if you're super open about, are people actually working? And, we're very much outcomes driven, not necessarily process driven. And video can be intimidating because then you feel like you have to sit up straight and be there the whole time, where we kind of had an open conversation. We said, let's break down those barriers. So we've invited people to bring in their family elements. So we had a talk the other day where 3 people just had their babies, just holding their kids and waving around. And we said, you know what, that's life. The reality is we don't want to create video conferences where you have to hide everything away. Bring them in, because we're a team. We want to be open anyway. So let's really embrace what this new working mode actually looks like.
Well, and I love something that you said in there, James. It's not about work-life balance anymore. It's about work-life integration. And we do have to recognize that working from home, your computer's there all the time. So I'm really conscious of making sure that the team takes breaks, that they go for lunch, that they go take a walk, and do those things, because otherwise it's very easy just to work 10, 12, 15 hours a day and just forget to have life. And so I really love that you do that, James. What a great idea with bringing the kids and whatnot in there. So
our small anecdote, our team member recently got a COVID test yesterday, and he didn't want to miss the team meeting. So he just had his video on the whole time. So we had a live first person view of getting tested. And it definitely adds a little exciting element to our team meetings.
That's brilliant.
Wow. I think that's a fascinating point, because there was a lot of research in the last few years about the importance of the third space between home and work. And I think while it's great, I think there's so many positives. And I think on the whole, this has humanized people. The fact that we see into each other's living rooms has given us greater empathy on the whole, and seeing each other as humans and interacting on a much more humanistic basis. But it does mean that there isn't the same line between leaving work, giving yourself that third space to then come home and be present as a partner, parent, child, whatever it might be. What are your thoughts on that? And maybe when we segue into that, so there's a psychological side of it, but I think maybe let's also touch on this question we had, which is, what are the big developing trends in product and ops at the moment, and what tools do you recommend? Because that will also kind of speak to, like, there's the psychology of how we're going to do separate working, and then there's like practically what's our new tool suite, because we are going to have to rely on much more transactional interactions now, much more kind of like we're talking by video, but here are your tasks, I'm out of here, let's go do them. What are your thoughts on that? James, you want to start?
Yeah, this is a tough one, and if I'm super honest, we've probably pivoted and tried multiple approaches. Even something as simple as creating, we use something like WorkAsk to be able to do to-do lists in a distributed manner. It's integrated with Slack, so that we take the time, and it's probably more a process change than a technology change. So the way that we have our weekly check-ins to align on all the goals as an entire organization, the way that we do daily check-ins and stand-ups have shifted a little bit, so that we provide more transparency into what everybody's doing. So we create task lists for everybody that's distributed. And we do have an end-of-day check-in deliberately to almost check out of work. Now, it doesn't mean that people always stop working, but it's a way to say, have I really achieved what I want to achieve?
That's great.
And some people do something as simple as changing outfits, right? It's like, hey, I'm clocking off now, so I'm bringing my baby in, or like I'm cooking dinner now. So like, it's also about respect, right? How do you respect each other's time?
Yeah.
Especially when you're in a startup, there is a bit of an always on mentality. And we do want to make sure that everybody finds their own mental space to be able to say, I'm taking a pause right now. So believe me, when I put my Slack notification to be like in meeting, or child emoji, or car emoji, because I'm driving my kids to kindergarten, or I'm walking my kids to school. So it's just really having that kind of respect and being a lot more conscious.
I completely agree with that. One of the things that we've instituted with Slack is we have an availability channel where everybody in the morning, they just pop in and say, today 8:30 to 4 is when I'm on. And then people will, when they go to lunch or have a coffee, just flag in there that, off for a walk, off for lunch, and then check back in. It's also some duty of care as well, because if someone says, when you're working from remotely, that I'm 9 to 5 today, and then at 2 o'clock, you still haven't heard anything from them, as a duty of care from leadership, you're picking up the phone and reaching out. And so we found that. And at first, I have to be honest, at first I was like, oh, I don't want to be plugging in. I don't want to be regimented to this time. And I don't want people to feel like we're clock watching and we're, you only worked 32 hours this week. But the more I got used to it, the more I think everybody really embraced it, because it was just a way of knowing. It's like, oh, okay, so-and-so's not until 9 today. Great. I'm not going to bother them for a little bit. So I think that's been really helpful. One of the things that I've struggled the most with, in all honesty, is I love having visuals in the office. And so I used to have walk the board. And so it would be like cards and post-it notes moving up and down. Is this in the design phase? Is this being executed with the projects across the top? And, we would do our walk the board every day or once a week of just where things are at. And I haven't yet found a good solution for it. I've tried Jamboard, I've tried Excel, working at Miro, and I just haven't found. So if anybody out there has the perfect solution for this, I'm all over it. I'd love to hear about it. So I think that's been one of the bigger challenges, is losing those visuals. But like anything, we're adapting and we're finding new tools. I also really encourage everybody to have their video on in meetings and not have an avatar there, because I think it's easy to hide behind that avatar, and it's very easy to get distracted if you're not having to look in a camera. It's just like, oh, there's a Slack message, oh, there's an email, and oh, there's the cat. Whereas when you're in a video, you're a lot more present, and I find that people are a lot more engaged. So those would be some of my recommendations and my experiences.
I love what both of you guys said about the kind of the transparency of availability. I think that's really awesome, and it has to be paired with the empowerment for people to choose, like kind of what I talked about before. In terms of finding a way to find that balance and giving people that empowerment, I totally agree with you, Toby. I think there's a lot of value of people having at least some video engagement throughout the day. I think you connect better, they hear you better, they absorb it better. I think there's a huge benefit to that. But I will also say that sometimes maybe a meeting or two a day, or even just a couple meetings a week, there are some where actually it's more, your participation is actually listening. And sometimes actually there's a good opportunity there for the group to kind of pre-agree that this is actually an audio only meeting. And as long as everyone's kind of listening, they can be folding the laundry or they can be taking a walk. So actually almost finding that way to merge some work time and personal time in parallel at the same time is kind of a cool way of providing people the flexibility to do it throughout their day. So, I mean, James, like the example you gave where your coworker was like on the way to his COVID test, that could have been an audio only meeting where it's like totally cool for him to just be listening and speaking. But extra cool that you guys like saw it happening. Did you see him like grimacing when they were doing it?
Nostril 1, nostril 2.
Oh man, I'm surprised they let you video it, because they've probably been hazmats and everything like that. I guess they've probably got relaxed about it now.
Yeah, I think they're used to people capturing that experience.
Yeah, and it is quite an experience. I've had a couple because I was overseas during all of this, and so came back to quarantine and test, and it's fun. I love one thing that you said there, Cassie. Sorry to change subject away from COVID and back to this, but I used to, with my one-on-ones with the team, with each team member, I would alternate the one-on-ones where one would be in the office with the computer up and going through, what are your priorities? Let's, look at your epics and kind of the business side of it. But then the alternating one-on-ones would be, we go for a walk or we go for coffee and have that's like the personal one, the coaching one, where we really like, where do you want to see yourself? Or, how was your weekend last weekend? What movies have you watched, kind of thing. And I do miss that a lot. And so I really love what you just said about audio only. And that's kind of got me thinking. And so if any of my team are on this call, I think we're going to start having walking meetings with audio only, just, walk wherever you live kind of thing. But that was a really great point, Cassie. Thanks. I enjoyed that.
Your tooling question around Jamboards and whatever else to use, Kwong and I were just having actually a chat on that on LinkedIn, like what tooling we use to manage it. Like from my perspective, I still can't look much past Trello at the moment for managing kind of both at a portfolio level and at a kind of tactical level, like what the epics and tasks you're trying to work on. I still don't think anyone's cracked really helpful, useful, like spot on agile product development and business running software. And so many people have tried, but Jira isn't it. I'm not convinced Asana is it. I'm not convinced Rike's it. Like a platform where you can break down the work that each element of the organizational layer cake is working on, be able to match and connect where there's dependencies, and be able to kind of just manage your work through it, alongside a simple to-do list view of what I individually need to do today. I still don't think that product's there right now, but Trello is the best option. I think it's got the most friendly pricing and that it's free. And, I'm chucking in other tools and platforms. I really recommend Whimsical. just because you could use mirror boards, but Whimsical, I think, is a great platform, just almost like an art director's board, to be able to throw whatever you want, structure it in any way. So you can put your wireframes in there, you can do operational workflows, you can do contact center flows, you could put mood boards in there. It's just a shared space for interaction and engagement. And I think going forward, my tip would be that kind of a platform that gives ultimate flexibility with just intuitive interfaces and blank spaces that people can collaborate in is going to be really useful for the future. So I really rate Whimsical. And obviously Slack as well as with its integrations, I think is a critical part of the stack. We've got some kind of questions here that we had put in, but if anyone on the call wants to ask any questions, please do just drop them in the Q&A or the chat, and we'll jump onto them in time. But I'll maybe work through some more of the questions we've got. They're probably a little bit more tactical, I think, about product and ops. So maybe we'll jump into those and just kind of see where we go. This one I think is quite interesting, kind of with a technical bent to it. How do you think no-code platforms will change the way we think about designing and building MVPs and production products? So I guess no-code platforms here is everything from Webflow, from a design and interface-based, website-based process, through to Bubble, which is a fully functional platform you can build pretty much anything in. And you guys had much exposure no code, and what are your thoughts on how that's going to change? It's getting big in the US, starting to come here in Oz, I know.
I mean, I'll take a crack at it. We have just a bit of context. We have a pretty engineering heavy team as part of our startup, which is why we're so fairly integrated into like GitHub. We use ZenHub for that exact reason. So the whole ticket structure has been something that our whole team decided to adopt, even from like an AI and sort of like marketing aspect. Like, how do we use tickets as the format to be able to issue issues and tasks? And I think we're very excited by no code, but at the same time, I think it's going to take some time for that transition to actually happen. So if you think about even like Stack integration, most companies will have a very specific tech stack already to be able to build in the way that suits you as an organization. So really it's about how does the entire team thinking about what aspects of your tech stack can be done in no code, right? So how much of your IP needs to be completely custom. And as an organization that works in live video streaming AI, frankly, it's a pretty young industry. So we don't have a lot of technologies that are constantly available to provide zero latency streaming from cameras, from drones, and from robotics. So we often have to almost be risky in taking on new technologies, testing them very quickly, and then making a very quick decision as to whether that's going to be right or not. I think what's important is finding what works best in the most effective manner. So there could be aspects of your technology stack that says, let's not redesign or reinvent library management or user role management. If there are libraries that we can take on, let's adopt that. So really taking the time to think about not just let's shift to no code. And I think we've seen that in the design industry as well, where at one stage there was like, oh, go from Photoshop to HTML. That has not worked out too well, right? And maybe it has for some organizations or some projects, but for things that are a lot more complex, it does require customization. So I would say, think about your entire product feature set and say which chunks of it makes most sense for that particular platform, and yeah, make a strategic decision based on that.
I'm gonna. Oh, go ahead. No, go ahead. No, please go ahead.
I was going to say, because it's interesting, James, because your background obviously is design into product, so you're a true product designer, and I think one of the obvious use cases is something like Webflow, where you've got to a stage of you've got something that's Figma-esque in how it works, but you've got the capacity to then deploy and create really good quality production sites. Do you think, and maybe this is quite a technical question, do you think there's really much difference between that and WordPress in terms of they are visual mechanics for build? I mean, I guess people argue that the Webflow output is better quality semantic code, but any thoughts on that?
Yeah, I love that analogy, because I think even we as an organization, we shifted to Squarespace, admittedly. Why? It's not that we didn't believe in building high quality websites, but we recognize as a startup, there's limited capacity. So our shift to Squarespace allowed our marketing teams to be much quicker and much more nimble at creating content because it's simpler. Now, we understand the trade-offs that we sacrifice in terms of flexibility. I think it's exactly the same thing. If there are some aspects of your product where it's really about speed of deployment and continual iteration, I think that's a perfect example of when something like that would be useful. If there are other elements where it's maybe closer to your core and has a longer term IP strategy, you might want to do that from a more custom basis. But I think it's a great question.
Toby, you going to say?
I was going to echo what James said. I think, and you really hit the nail on the head there, James. I think it also, a lot of it needs to be driven by the tech team. I mean, product, obviously, I mean, we're a product driven company and, you know, we're all product people. So of course, product is the center of the universe in any business. But, you know, the tech team are the ones delivering on those visions. And so I think we also have to really rely on their expertise and their know-how and their bits. So, I mean, I work really, really tightly with our CTO and our head of engineering to make sure that the tech team has the tools that they need and they make a lot of those decisions and they're empowered to use their own tooling. We're also CI/CD, so which I'm assuming everybody is at this point. And so the industry is changing so quickly that whatever tool makes the lives easier for everybody, I think is the tools to jump on. But I would encourage any product team out there to work really closely with your technology team and make those decisions together.
Cassie, anything to add?
Yeah, sure. There is some like background noise happening. So I'm like, this is a great opportunity to go on mute. So I think you guys said it so well, Toby and James. And I guess my main point would have been actually what you guys had already mentioned, which is actually, I think like most things in business, you need to think about what you need to achieve and what's the most efficient way of getting it. So it's absolutely fit for purpose. Do what's fit for purpose. So James, you mentioned a lot of examples where kind of a no code or low code option is the most practical in your particular situation. Whereas there are other things that really need, they need more complex and flexible code to be built. So that's what I would say. And I'd actually say it's just kind of a learning or like an approach that applies to pretty much everything, especially in the startup scale environment where resources are scarce and speed is important.
Yep.
Good segue. It was actually Michael Wendlands from one of our attendees has just asked a great question here, which actually feeds into what you touched on, Toby, which was products at the center of the universe. Like each area, I don't know, it was tongue in cheek, obviously, each area, obviously you come from a discipline-centric perspective. One of our questions beforehand was, where does product sit in the organization? Where does it fit with ops, marketing, and other disciplines, especially in SME where we all have to wear multiple hats, more so than in corporate. And Michael's asked about, have you heard about the role of product operations that's starting to emerge in product-led companies, particularly in the US? And it's kind of a dedicated role that bridges product, sales, success, support, and marketing. So I think it's really interesting. He says they own the collection of customer product insight to inform product decisions and the communication of product decisions to the organization. What are your thoughts on this? So I'll go first. I've got some pretty strong views on this. I'm pretty old school. I'm pretty Ben Horowitz, good product manager, bad product manager on this. Like for me, the role of the product manager shouldn't be passed off to proxies, which you often see in corporates. I understand if it has to happen, then I get it. You have a lot of corporates have product managers and product owners and various different people, and they delineate around. Like if you're structuring like that, you're not being able to leverage the true power of product and an agile organization. You're not being able to draw a straight line between customer insight, deployment to market. And however big you are, that cycle time has got to be the most precious time, in my opinion, for you to leverage. And so if you have someone who's product operations, then that means the product person is getting to evolve some of their responsibility for the product to someone else. And the reality is, I think the product manager needs to work with ops, customer success, sales, design, whoever it is, to get to the output that's needed for the customer insight that they are responsible for owning, the space that they're responsible for owning, the value output that they are responsible for producing. So I haven't heard of product ops. Obviously, product design is a relatively new thing. So product designers are a relatively new thing to arrive. anyway, that's my thoughts. I think the product person is responsible. That's great. I don't know how big a fan I am of new roles, more complexity. What do you guys think?
I think, Rich, it probably comes down to how the org is structured and the breadth with which the product manager is assigned. So if the way that they've structured their, ops is that the product manager is actually across many different topics, it might be like a workload distribution thing.
Sure.
They feel that they need that product operations person to help provide the insights in an efficient way to the product manager so they can execute. Whereas the other perhaps option would be if the product managers are assigned to a very defined scope, then they should have hopefully the bandwidth to be doing that direct communication with all those orgs. So I wonder, perhaps it's a little bit about how they're structured, whether or not that kind of role makes sense. But I think ultimately the fact that those orgs are connected is the most important thing. I think actually that the best companies understand how to leverage the knowledge from their frontline staff, so the sales, the account management, the customer support, and to drive those insights to the product team in an efficient way and an insightful way, and on a regular, like real constant basis, as opposed to it being kind of an afterthought, or only when customer service is like screaming that there's an issue, do the product managers kind of, oh, maybe we'll talk about that in like a month. We're pretty busy until then. It's actually the intertwining that's the most important, I think.
That's true. That capacity thing is absolutely critical. And I'm probably being far too much of a purist there, because the reality is, like, probably 90% of the time as a product person, I am heads down on whatever new feature we're building. And if you can increase the speed to which bugs are going to be able to be brought into the system that are having just as big an impact as features. And I know this is an area that Michael's business looks at, this kind of space of like, where are we putting our capacity? And we're probably not the best callers. And the first line on that is customer success. So
I'm a lot like you, Rich. I'm a bit of a purist, but you also have to just recognize, I think, that the size of the business and where the business is at in its startup and scale up journey. In a startup, the product manager, product owner, whatever title we want to put there, has their hands everywhere. They are customer support. They are doing the research. They are the everything in that. And so they do have their hands everywhere. As the business scales more and more, you have those other roles in where customer support does come in, and you've got a broader reach, but product still sits on top of all of that. Like product still, when I did the diagram when I was putting the strategy together, that, here's product, and you've got your leadership, you've got sales, you've got marketing, you've got technology, you've got all these touch points. And so as long as you've set something up where those comms come through, and Cassie, I love how you said it, that it's not an afterthought, this is an everyday thing. And so I know for me, from a product perspective, I love it when you have a PM and a PO paired together, so that the PO can, run the ship, do the daily, and kind of look at that now to 3 month purview, where the product manager then is looking at the 3 months to a year, really doing that strategic planning. But again, depending on resources and the size of the business, you don't always have that opportunity. And so while it would be really beautiful to say, here's your responsibility, here's your responsibility, here's your responsibility, fact of the matter is you're never going to, unless you're corporate, you're never going to have those truly defined lines. And so I think there's a lot of ambiguity. And so there's really no right answer to this question or wrong answer. I think it's really a case by case more than anything.
I would also add, as an ops person, I would kind of just call out that the communication between these orgs is actually both ways. So the insights that happen from sales and customer service and account management and all those frontline team members is super valuable and must go to the product world so they can use it and make decisions. But actually, if you think about it, especially in these kind of fast moving environments, product is making decisions and changing the way that customers interact with your product. And the frontline people need to understand that, because that changes how they pitch the product. It changes how they instruct the customer to fix their problem and so on. So actually, it needs to be intertwined, but both ways. So there's a lot of responsibility on the product team or the processes and communication methods that are built to make sure that those frontline staff are getting that feedback from product about what is changing. And actually just like keeping the boat afloat with that like circular communication is one of the most important things for operations leaders to make sure. Because imagine something has changed about the product, and it probably does every week or even more often, depending on your release schedule, and your customer service team don't know about it. Imagine how the calls are going to go that week.
Oh,
or your sales team is completely mispitching your solution. So I just wanted to kind of call that out, another reason why it's so important, I think.
Well, and I'd also like to just add on to that, that sales doesn't, I mean, sales loves to try to drive everything, but sales doesn't always know what customers actually need. And so I've worked with sales countless times. It's like, oh, we have to have this. And really all it is it's just some sex on the page to help them sell something, but it doesn't actually provide any value to the customers. And so there's a really fine balance. And that's why I love to try to sit in on as many sales pitches as I can. So I'm hearing what the sales team is saying, and I'm also hearing that feedback from the client, because I think a lot of things get lost in translation, particularly between sales. Customer service, they do understand the users a lot more than sales does in a lot of cases. And so there's a really fine balance that, when sales is barking up and down for something, it's like, really, do you really need that? You just want this flashy button because you think it's going to look good, but the button's not actually going to do anything. So
it's like you have one client that you really want to close and they really want that thing. So it's totally, it needs to be in the product team's, empowerment to make that judgment call about like, what's the magnitude, what's the proportion of customers where this thing is going to really help? Thank you for that feedback. That would help like 3%, but I'm going to focus my team on the thing that's going to help 70% instead. Like, maybe we'll get to that someday.
Well, you don't want to be bespoke, right? It's the 80-20 rule. So sorry, James, I know you've been trying to pipe in there.
You're right. I completely echo all the sentiments that shared by both of you. And I think scale is totally correct, because everything that we're talking about is more about a function and a responsibility. And it's at what point does that too much for an individual person to have to hold together before you start to distribute it to somebody else? That needs to be part of the team. It shouldn't be a separate role. It shouldn't be, here are the linear roles. It's about how do they kind of come together. But I think the other perspective that I want to share is it also depends on the complexity of the product and the complexity of the use case. So for example, we are a company that focuses more as a horizontal player. So by definition, we have very distinct vertical applications that are very different. What a city organization needs versus a transport authority versus a wind farm versus a pipeline organization has such distinct needs that as a product person, I absolutely want to know everything about their needs, their challenges, what success looks like for them. But at some point, and I know that's going to happen in the future, it's going to be too much to handle. What the biggest wind farm customer needs from our product is very different to what the largest cities in the US require. And it's like, how do we navigate and how do we make those trade-offs between those? And I think it's, I don't see that as a separate function. I see that almost as a process change. So one thing that we've started to implement is a new product prioritization session, where I kind of call it like the Jedi Council, where it seems like you have one representative from customer success, strategy, product, engineering, and we sit together and say, present your case. Share those insights on a weekly or fortnightly basis. What are the new things you're hearing from customers? What are the new things you're hearing from success? What are sales really needing, right? We hear that term, we need to have this. This is the highest priority. And when I put it onto the board and I say, these are the 10 highest priority, which one's the real highest priority? And what are the trade-offs that you need to make that decision? And I think that's kind of like the process that's really important to say, right, you have 10 customers who all need this. We can only do 3. Here's your $100. How would you diversify your funds to think about what to invest in? And everyone has that voice. Then product takes it away and says, we had the chance. That's your one chance every week to be able to share what's most important to you. Now let us take that feedback and make a product decision and share that back with you. I think that feedback loop that you mentioned, Cassie, was super important. Let's go back and say, that was the meeting that happened. This is what we agreed on. Do we all agree? Yes, no. And then we proceed so that, when the next round happens, we say, look, you said you needed this functionality to sale. We've delivered that. Is the sell happening? Are the customers now satisfied? And making sure that we have that continuous feedback loop.
Yep. Yeah, and it's when everything's a priority, nothing's a priority, right?
Absolutely.
Yeah, exactly.
Ops teams can do a really good job of those kinds of meetings or those kind of feedback sessions when they try to bring some additional data to the conversation. So like some quantifiable data about the magnitude of how often they're getting this request, or how it's impacting customer satisfaction scores, or things like that. So I think there are a lot of ways to really make the best of the kind of communication you mentioned, James. And you can, I think really great ops teams can take a lot of that responsibility on themselves to present you guys with the information that you need to make those right judgment calls.
I think this space we've moved into, it's such an interesting area. We had a question beforehand, which was, when do you not listen to customers? I.e., how you draw the line between customer obsessed and customer led. And I think we've kind of actually answered that quite well here. And I think this, the Jedi Council you talked about, James, is this context, such an important piece. How do you bring together the different parts of the org to have these conversations? And I've experienced this work really well and really badly. And right here is the crux of it. And the capacity, Cassie, you said, for everyone to bring sensible quant, to make a joint decision, to not be a battle of the data and not be a battle of the opinions. And if we talk about the role of product needs to be the one that coordinates, organizes, structures, ensures that conversation and interaction and engagement and measurement is done in a way that can then be consumed and turned into action in the product that's produced, which also means they have to have the responsibility on it. Because I remember having the debate so many times, if product people don't have the responsibility for the product they're producing, therefore if they don't make the call, they're not product managers. You can't be a product manager without the capacity to make that call. And that's kind of a critical thing. Answers quite a few of the questions we have here. What makes great product people? What's the role of product in the org? Like we've got some of these questions. That's the fundamental of it. It's to own the decision making as a servant leader to the organization, to basically go, you're all saying a ton of stuff. How do we rule it? Well, let's all have a really good conversation. And I think that's critical. That Jedi Council is made up of people who are in the weeds on it, like who are actually working it day. They're not executive, general manager, blah, blah, blah. They're the people who are really doing it day in, day out. And that's okay when you're a startup and scale up. But as you get further up the stack to a 50, 100, 200 person organization, it's so easy for that to be the kind of managers, the founders to still sit in that for too long, the exec to sit in that for too long. That's kind of an observation I'd say. What are your war stories in this kind of space? Have you guys see any great practice or terrible practice?
I actually think I think that at some stage it's a little bit practical for the leaders to be that once you get quite bigger. But I actually would say the real action that's needed here is for the leaders to be dedicating a portion of their time to be on the ground with their staff, especially in the ops space. So like, I think any ops leader, whether they're like a head of, a COO, whatever, like they should be making sure that they are talking to customers directly themselves. They are listening in on the sales calls. They're jumping in to help with escalations. You obviously can't do that with a lot of your time, but you need to stay super connected with that kind of thing and do it with some of your time. And really stay in the weeds as much as you possibly can so that you continue to be valuable in these kinds of things. Also, you can just do things like bring along some people from the other parts of your org. So yeah, you could have managers in this meeting who have done a good job of staying hands-on and have them bring like almost like a second along with them from the ground. And I think that's probably like a practical approach that I've seen work well for me.
I think it can be a really touchy area because founder-led businesses, it was their idea, it was their baby. It's very, very hard for them to step away as the business grows. And I have been in businesses where it has been really successful that the founder has stepped away and empowered and trusted everybody. Obviously, they still have some strategic input and some insights and want to hear how things are going, but they're not in there every day tapping on the shoulder. Have you built this? Have you built this? In businesses where the founders are too deeply in the weeds, nobody feels like they've got freedom or nobody feels empowered to do their job. They just become doers. Whereas in founder-led businesses where I understand completely what you're saying, Cassie, but there's a very fine line in that where I'm very fortunate in the role that I'm in now that our founder and CPO he's found that perfect balance where he stays in touch and he knows kind of what's happening, but he has also given us a lot of runway to trust. And, you bring in the right people, you just have to trust and empower them. And that's how you get the best results. So yeah, I've been on both sides of it in my career. And it's definitely, it all comes down to the two words I love the most, which are trust and empowerment. And I think that we have to do that even as leaders for any of our direct reports. We have to give them that same amount of runway and not be tapping on the shoulder all the time. And let people fail in some things, let people make some mistakes and learn from them. That's how we all got to our careers, right? So, or to our position. So those are my thoughts. James, what do you think?
I think I won't go too deep into some of the more horrifying war stories, but I think one area that has always almost overpowered product is always, where's the money at, right? The conversation of, oh, we're a business, so business should have the loudest voice, or this customer is generating the most revenue, so we should have the loudest voice. And that, I think that's something that's kind of sometimes can be tough to be able to find the right balance. And I think when you're a startup and you are small and you need to be able to prove yourself through revenue, I think that can happen at times, and that can completely blow out your product roadmap. It can completely blow out your timing, right? And I think that works okay at times, but when you get to a certain size where you start to realize building these features out of order or ad hoc starts to cause more bugs, more challenges, and the ripple effect starts to get larger, I think it's important to make sure that we're clear on the trade-offs and impact of every decision. So now when we have that sort of product prioritization sessions that we have, we say, great, we can build this first because we hear you, we see the value of this customer, but we take the time to say, I go into those meetings and say, well, if this happens, this is the impact. Are we okay to accept that? And I think having that foresight to say, we may not see the impact for 3 or 6 months, but as long as we recognize that this is a big decision and it's in a way a minor pivot, do we agree as in the collective so that we don't go back and point fingers and say, well, why did this happen? Or I told you so. No, we made a collective decision. I think that's really, really key. And I'm fortunate now that, our founder, who's, a tech founder, he's also very into the weeds with our customers, gives that meeting the respect that everybody has an equal voice. And the way that we manage these meetings is that it's not necessarily about making a decision, it's about being heard. So everybody share their perspective. Let's take a time to really process and then come back and share and then make an agreement before moving forwards. Now that sounds very process driven, but I was starting to find that these little steps are absolutely critical to ensure that you have good delivery, especially in the short and medium term.
Well, I love how you said there with the trade-off that particularly in startups, you do have that trade-off because you do have your first customer and they're the ones with that loudest voice. You have to be really careful not to fall down that slippery slope, because all of a sudden your product can take on a whole new direction than where you actually wanted it to go. The other thing with product, and you alluded to this as well, James, that product people, we have to be able to say no. Like we have to be able to push back, and it's not just the trade-off on things, but it's very easy to be intimidated when, the CEO or the founder comes in and says, I want you to build this. It can be intimidating to say, well, actually, no, you don't want that. And here's the reasons. It's a lot easier to say, okay, sure, whatever you want. And so I think as you evolve within product, it's a lot of those data-driven decisions, and you have to be able to say, okay, well, I hear what you're saying, but again, these are the trade-offs. Is it really worth this to you? And obviously, end of the day, a founder or a CEO is still ultimately going to make that call, but they need to be really informed, and that's up to product to, with all the information that we're collecting from everybody, to be that informant.
Mm-hmm. I think this segues again nicely to another question here, which is, what attributes make great product people and great operations people? Because I think you put it beautifully there. Great product and ops people have to walk a line. They have to be data driven, but have empathy and emotional resonance as well. And they have to be able to take a huge number of inputs, parse them, reason them through, and make an argument. And on the surface, that sounds like a comparatively simple thing to do, but in practice, that kind of critical thinking and articulacy is really, really hard to have. So I'd love to get your thoughts on, what are the real key attributes for great product people and ops people? Some of them will be shared, some will be different. And maybe also your thoughts on career and what it takes to get there, and where you develop some of those skills and core competencies as well. Because most of the great product and ops people I've worked with have blends of discipline experience, haven't just worked one role their entire lives. And I think that blend's probably quite critical to it. See what you guys think on what makes great. Who wants to go? Cassie, you go first.
So for ops people, when I say ops, what I'm talking about, it can mean different things in each org depending on the business model, but it often means what I've been describing, which is like your sales, account management, customer service, those kinds of teams, retention, and so on. And I actually think when you consider what the day-to-day roles of these people are, there are a few things that are most critical. One is their empathy and their ability to communicate very, very effectively, both written and verbal. Communication is probably number one. Number two is probably resilience, because sales, that's a tough gig. Like, you get rejected quite a lot. So you need to have a lot of personal resilience to continue being super effective at your job and not get beaten down too much. Same for customer service. You're hearing problems all day, a lot of the time. And so you need that resilience to stay really constructive and positive with your role and in your communications with your customers. I think it's like a really added bonus if these kinds of teams have detail-oriented nature. This is not easy to find sometimes, but this real superstars that I see in ops are detail-oriented and like kind of efficient and effective with their time, and they look for ways to continue making things more efficient. Ops teams are like a wonderful place within the org where there should continue to be internal innovation to automate like different parts of it and try to reduce the admin load for these teams. So I would say when an ops person has a bit of that capability to look out for those opportunities, it makes them a bit more of a star.
I'll jump in, James. Both. For me, I think in product, first and foremost, you have to be able to listen. You have to be a really, really strong listener, because you're hearing things obviously from everywhere. Empathy is, Rich, you've mentioned this multiple times, that kind of goes without saying, because we do have to feel kind of the customers and be in their shoes. I always say you check your ego at the door. I think product people, you can't have an ego, because it's not about you. You're almost like the ones hurting the cats. And so while ultimately the buck stops with you to make some of these decisions, it can't be ego based. And I know that the same thing with salespeople tend to have some of those egos, and like, it's why they're in sales, right? It's a certain type of personality, whereas product people tend to be extroverted, obviously, because you're dealing with a lot of different stakeholders, or an extroverted introvert, whichever way you want to look at that. And then being able to, and I'm not even using my words really well right now to say, being able to articulate, you have to be able to formulate all the reasons as to the why. So while being in the weeds, but also seeing that really big picture, like you have to be able to see the forest for the trees. So that wasn't the most articulate of answers. So maybe cut that part of the recording out when this goes online.
No, that's great. I think there's a degree of objectivity, and like I see there's a lot of like what I'm gonna struggle with my words now, but there's this interesting like tension for products. I feel like you have to be very objective, but also very passionate, right? You have to be objective at the decision you're going to make. You have to be strong-headed to be able to be confident to move forward with whatever objective decision, even if it's not exactly what you want to do, right? It may be like product needs this, but I can bend a little bit because of the business requirements. I think there's something about being really detailed and having I feel like you got to be a little bit sick in the head when you want to be like that detailed, you're that involved with the design, with the product feature, with the line of code, with the execution. But then you need to very quickly parachute up to 50,000 feet and say, does this actually make sense for the overall product roadmap? Or am I too detailed, right? Like, how do you always constantly flex between the two? And I think that oscillation between detailed and high level, between obsessed and objective, to being very empathetic, but at the same time having a perspective. And that perspective is different to ego, because at the end of the day, that business or organization will still go to you as head of product and say, you're the head of product, you need to push us forwards. And I think that comes with a little bit of, oh my God, are we steering the ship in the right way? But you have to remember, your decision isn't my decision, it's a team decision. You've taken the time to be objective. You've gathered all the feedback, and you're presenting the best course forwards, not because of your own perspective, but as perspective of the company. And you've taken that role to be able to gather that perspective.
You found your words really beautifully there, for the record, James. No, it's so true, and it's product people. You have to be flexible. Like, you cannot be rigid in your days. You have to know that every day you might start up with, here's a list of the objectives I want to get through the day. At the end of the day, chances are you haven't hit any of those, because the life of a product manager is organized chaos, is how I like to describe it. And you have to be willing to flip on a dime. You have to be willing to change context every 2 minutes and be really flexible. It's not for the faint of heart. And so product, like I said, I love the chaos. It's one of the reasons I love being in product. It's just every minute is something different and every day is something different. So
we've got a question from Rifat here, and I think it's really related to this. And Kwong, I think you did it beautifully there. I think that product people have to have conviction without ego. So I think it's this balance of kind of having conviction, having a position lightly held, and having a reason behind it and your logic there, but be willing to change it. If the buck stops with you, you have to have a position. So you have to actually have a really healthy, balanced ego to do that. Rifat asked, what is the best way to refuse, say no to a customer or stakeholder request without making them dissatisfied? Working in the product space, we need to be very diplomatic when refusing or assigning low priority for requests. And this is probably the thing I hear most frequently from product people, particularly if you're not already, you're not a head of product or CPO, or there's a role where you have some authority established. It's the product person who has all of the responsibility, but none of the authority to be able to push it through. We've touched on the behaviors you need to have. Resilience is a huge one here. Any recommendations or suggestions for Rifat when you're trying to do that, when you're trying to position yourself? Now, ideally, the organization has positioned you appropriately, but normally they haven't. So any ideas on how to best deal with those challenges?
I mean, I'll take a crack. My gut tells me, is there really a no, right? I think any feedback is always good feedback. Any customer who's willing to share something with you is extremely valuable. And I think if you're not listening to that, then who are you listening to, right? And even if your answer is, it may not fit within the timeline or may not fit within the product fit, I think taking that feedback and taking the time to understand that request in a more deep manner is really important. One way to often address it is provide that transparency. Provide the transparency to say, actually, this is the full roadmap and your request does fit within it. However, it needs to fit into it at a very specific time or specific moment. I think that's one area that's really important. If there is a scenario where it doesn't quite fit, however, then you can still champion and say, that is actually a great suggestion. How do you distill it? How do you take the elements of what that request really is? And how do you build it in a way that's actually useful? How do you really understand what the request is really trying to achieve as an outcome and think, are there other ways to be able to achieve that? So sometimes it's like saying, is the request based on a process? I think, Toby, you mentioned before, does a customer really want something that's, sex on a page? Or do you actually understand deeper and say, oh, they're trying to achieve a specific workflow, or they want to extract a specific data point? How are other ways in which we can do that? And how do we share back to the customer and say, we are actually achieving this outcome for you through a very different means, and taking the time for them to understand what that actually looks like. At the same time, when you have the request come through from a product team, Rich, you mentioned it's about checking your ego. Take the time to understand, how do you quantify that? I'd love to be a quant decision-making process to say, well, where does that sit within everything else? Help me understand the justification. And if you can justify it, and I'm open to be proven wrong, then absolutely. If the data supporting it is not strong enough, or you're able to rebut and say, actually, this is a great data point, but it is the 20%, not the 80%, and we're on a critical path, how do you help them understand that better?
Well, and I think oftentimes customers don't really know what they want. They think they want X. And so that comes down when really they want Y or Z. And it comes down to, from a product perspective, really being able to listen. And like James, you just said that so perfectly, is just distill what they're after, like really understand what it is. And oftentimes you can go back and say, actually, you know what? You don't really want this. And here's the reasons why. I mean, you can, obviously you do it in a more diplomatic way, but I found that more often than not, it's something so left field that they actually don't really need it, but it takes someone from product to understand and listen to that. And I think people just want to be heard at the end of the day too. They just want to know that their voices, and with that transparency to say, thank you so much for engaging with us. This is really wonderful that you're asking for this. And, then again, hear that. And then with transparency, tell them straight up, like people don't want to be lied to, or people don't want to be, belittled or things like that. Just be straight up and say, thanks for this, but it's not part of the broader vision, but we'll keep it in the backlog for future consideration. And oftentimes that's enough for people just to have their voice.
Yeah.
Now that being said, saying no to a manager or a leader in the business is a lot harder than saying no to a customer. Saying no to your boss or your boss's boss, that can be intimidating. And I think that the easiest way to do it is hopefully you're in an environment where you feel safe and that you feel like you are heard and trusted. And so if you do disagree on something, that you're in a place that it's okay to do that. If you're in a place where it's not okay to do that, you probably want to find a different job. Because you do, that's why we're in here. I mean, like, everybody's hired for a reason. They're hired for their talent, and we just need to trust our team. And so if you're saying no for a reason. Just give that reason.
Yeah, I love what you said, Toby, that the difference between saying no to a customer and saying no to someone internally, especially if they might have a little bit more seniority than you. I agree completely that actually it's about articulating well the reasons why and the rationale. And generally I find, everyone wants the same thing, which is for your business to be as successful as possible. So if you provide good rationale and your recommendation is truly the best way forward, that conversation should go pretty well. It might be not what they expected, but once you show them why it's clearly the best way forward, hopefully, most people are pretty logical, and that'll be smooth sailing on that particular topic. But I know that's not always the case. Someone might have specific agendas and so on. But I do find that generally speaking, if you do a good job of providing the rationale, it's helpful for that conversation internally, at least.
Yep.
It is, without doubt, I think this is the hardest space for product people to tread. So sympathy with you, Rifat, and all product people out there who are dealing with stakeholder management, customer management. It's been a great discussion. We're just a little bit over time, so I think we'll probably kind of wrap it up there. But I'd love if you guys could finish up with just kind of your final thoughts on great career advice. We've got a couple of questions around what's the most valuable career advice you've received to date, where did it come from, and what was it? So maybe we could just finish with your one-liners on your best career advice and any recommendations to people out there for their careers.
I'll start.
You go first, Cassie.
Oh, James, sorry, go ahead.
No, Cassie, you go for it.
My advice, the minute you asked that, I was like, I know what it is. So it's actually something that my dad would say to me many times throughout my whole life, actually. And it's not necessarily career advice. It's kind of just like an attitude for life, but it translates very well to career, which is you can do anything you put your mind to. So I think the way that I interpret that for career is that, like, the opportunities to achieve are there. Like, anything is possible, but you have to really work for it. So you need to actually be super dedicated. You need to work hard. You need to be a creative problem solver. You need to, you need to really have that drive and grit. And if you do, then it's possible to achieve. And so I think that applies to, like, every day in the startup and scale up space where you're trying to solve really difficult problems that no one has solved before. So you need to believe that it's possible, and you need to have the grit to figure out the way to make it possible. But it also applies to your career as well, I think. Believe that you're capable of anything as long as you really, like, dedicate the effort to it and have that perseverance.
I would also add on to that, don't be afraid to ask for things. I mean, you never know if you don't ask. People don't generally just hand things to you. Be your best champion, be your own champion on things, and say, this is important to me. I want this. And if you see an opportunity, don't be afraid that what's the worst that's going to happen is you might get a no, but there's a good chance that you're going to get a yes. And so never be afraid of those things. The other piece of advice that I would give, and I put this in my video because it was the most impactful thing that ever happened in my career, that I was sitting in a conference room, and I'm on the shorter side of the height spectrum. And so I had my chair all the way down low so my feet could touch the ground. And there was men in the room who were quite tall. And so they overshadowed me. And so I looked small in that room, and they were looking down at me. And my mentor at the time, after that meeting, she said, don't ever do that again. Next time, she said, have your chair all the way up. Make eye contact, be level with them. If your feet are dangling, who cares? No one's looking under the table. And that was the best piece of advice, because it completely changed my whole confidence level when I would go into meetings, because I would be sitting up higher and equal with people. So it's a silly little thing, but it really is. It's important when you go into a room. Those are your equals and your peers. We're all human. And so don't belittle yourself, and just have the confidence in that room. So little anecdote for you. James?
I love that. I really believe in just having a vision for what you want to do and be in life, no matter how grand or how silly it might seem. Because I think too often people think, oh, but I always wanted to be a dancer or an astronaut and I can't do that. And I think it's not about can't, it's about distilling what it is about that dream or vision you had and either following that path or make that job happen. You know, and it's very similar to the whole product process. Unless you have a vision and you break down what those objectives are, it's very hard to make those decisions throughout your career. I knew that I really wanted to do technology and it'd be the convergence of hardware and software. It didn't matter actually what industries or what, like, I had to do that through, because every time I was given a project, do you want to do A or B? I just think about which one aligned best towards my own vision. And I think these major decisions throughout my career helped me. And I didn't always know it at the time. I just had to follow that gut and not be afraid to ask and say, I really want to work in artificial intelligence. Which project has that, right? And the project would say, well, there's this one, but it's in agriculture. I know nothing about ag, but I asked the question and I said, that's aligned to my broader vision. So I'm going to do that, maybe for a month, maybe for 3, maybe for 6. And I think that's kind of how you sort of like navigate the course of life into a career.
That's awesome. Thanks, James. And I think that context of having a sense of self, a sense of vision, a sense of purpose is absolutely integral to anything. And we're no longer living linear career journeys. That's a lot of what this conference and a lot about what about the level product is about, which is about how do we get from good to great in a career that's now made up of a series of sprints in different industries, in different spaces, different roles with different people. And I think the core thing that doesn't change is you, or rather does, it just evolves and gets better. So thanks so much for your time, everyone. That's been absolutely awesome. Pleasure to have you on here. And we'll get the video out and everyone can watch it on the site soon. Thanks very much and we'll catch you soon.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.
Cheers.
Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
everyone.